very warm welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure and an honor to briefly introduce someone who doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Professor Martin Jay, who is the Sidney Hellman Ehrman Professor of History at the University of California at Berkeley, and quite simply, one of the great intellectual historians of our time. Just a minute ago, I asked Klaus whether he could think of a good translation of intellectual history in German. And Ideengeschichte doesn't quite, I mean, at least it sounds, you know, as old-fashioned as some German words in academia sound. And Geistesgeschichte is even worse. So intellectual history for Martin Jay means that he provides you with a history of philosophical or other ideas in the humanities, but he provides you with the key to understanding that history. And so in this sense, it is really intellectual history. It is the history not just of a Geist, but of many Geister who are combined by a certain Geist about what they do. He focuses, especially, as you all know, on European intellectual history of the 20s, mainly 20th century, especially on critical theory, but also on cultural criticism and various forms of cultural theory. He received his PhD in 1971 at Harvard University with the work that then appeared a few years later in 73 as the Dialectical Imagination, which covers the history of the Frankfurt School from 1923 to 1950. Doing research on that book, he had the good chance to visit and speak to a number of the protagonists of the Frankfurt School, as it was then called, Leo Löwenthal, but also Pollock, Horkheimer, many others. He was also here in Frankfurt in 1968, right, doing research on the book and spoke to a number of people here. I won't mention all the visiting professorships, fellowships, honors, and so on, but I should mention the Berlin Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Berlin. That first book then was translated with a preface, but the preface was also in the English version by Max Horkheimer as Dialektische Fantasie. And his work after that was occupied itself with some of the adventures and developments within Marxism, but also many other forms of thought in cultural and critical theory. There's, let me just mention of the many books, a few of the most important. There's the 1984 Marxism and Totality, The Adventures of a Concept from Lukács to Habermas. Every one of you who knows a bit about Marxist theory knows that the notion of totality is a very important one and a contested one in any Marxist theory. In the same years, a shorter book on Adorno, Permanent Exiles, is a book in 85, essays on the intellectual migration from Germany to America, which also attests to what Martin Jay is occupied with in his work. There's Fantasiekel Socialism and other essays. In 1993, Downcast Eyes, the denigration of vision in 20th century French thought, analyzing, you know, the anti-ocular prejudices of certain forms of French thought. 2003, Refractions of Violence. A year later, Songs of Experience, Modern American and European Variations on a universal theme, namely the theme of experience. Essays from the Edge, Paraga and Parali Pomina in 2011. And 2016, we owe him another great book about critical theory, namely this one, Reason After Its Eclipse, on late critical theory, reconstructing the critical discourse on and of reason since German idealism through critical theory, including Habermas and some other contemporary theorists. His work has been discussed in many venues and in many ways, but I should mention the beautiful book that some of his students, including Peter Gordon, who will be delivering the Adorno lectures later this summer, have edited, and that deals with Martin Jay's work with the beautiful title, The Modernist Imagination, Intellectual History and Critical Theory Essays in honor of Martin Jay. Martin, it's a great honor to have you here, and we very much look forward to your talk.
Thanks so much, Rainer, for that very, very gracious introduction. I'd like to thank Rebecca, Klaus, and Rainer for inviting me here. This is actually the 50th anniversary to the month of the time that I came to Frankfurt to work on my dissertation. So it's very poignant, really, to be here. And to see this picture of Horkheimer reading the book that came out of that. This picture was taken apparently shortly before he died. And I've always suspected that his reading the book hastened his departure. I'm not sure, but in any event, it's a picture that means a lot to me as well. In the early winter of 1971, Herbert Marcuse visited Jerusalem as a guest of the Van Leer Foundation. He gave talks in Haifa and Beersheba as well. In addition to his academic encounters, he requested and was granted a meeting with the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, which took place on December 29th. They discussed, among other things, possible negotiations between Israel and Egypt in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. They also discussed a two-state solution to the conflict based on an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories and the chances of a new violent conflict unless Israel did so. Marcuse seems to have solicited from Moshe Dayan an admission that Israel had originally seized land that belonged to the Palestinians, but admitted in turn that in the recent war, Israel, quote, did nothing wrong in defending its existence. Now, I begin with this anecdote not to revisit the troubled history of the Middle East in the past half-century, or at least not primarily for that reason, but rather to foreground the highly symbolic nature of this unusual encounter between Marcuse, the iconic figure of the New Left who inspired, as no one else, the student-led unrest of 1968, and Moshe Dayan, the military hero of the decisive victory of Israel in that war, a war that took place only a year earlier. And in so doing, I want to signal my belief that we need to expand our understanding of the meaning of this talismanic year 1968 to include the seemingly distinct events that transpired in the Middle East the previous year. In so doing, we can enrich our understanding of the critical theorists' fraught relationship to the German New Left and their differing response to post-colonial struggles. Only, in fact, by exploring the Frankfurt School's response to the Six-Day War and more generally to the Palestinian cause as a putative placeholder for third world anti-imperialist struggles, can we make sense, I want to argue, of the meaning of 1968 a half-century later, and what now seems its relative importance in this drama of global history, the last 50 or so years. Now, in a conventional sense, to be sure, 1968 has already been situated in temporally and spatially expanded contexts. Historians, for example, often argue that its starting point should be more or less put in about 1960, when the left wing of the Socialist German Student Union, the SDS, broke from the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. What's sometimes called the long 1960s are understood to have ended only in 1977 and the so-called German Autumn, which led to the turn away from violent struggle symbolized by the collapse of the Red Army faction and the acceptance of electoral politics by the nascent Green Party. In spatial terms, the generational rebellion cum political rupture that has come to be identified with the year 1968 has been cited in no fewer than 39 countries around the world, with the other major outbreaks located in America, France, Italy, Japan, and Mexico. Unrest in the Soviet bloc, especially in Czechoslovakia and Poland, has also been understood as part of a larger story, a larger spatial story that situates the German 68 in that global context. Without doing so, without understanding the global 60s, it has seemed impossible to make sense of how heavily influenced the German case was by cultural and political trends from the outside. Now, both of these expansions, this temporal and spatial expansion, both of them implicitly posit an essential coherence, either as a diachronic narrative or as a unified synchronic comparison. In the temporal sequence, in the temporal expansion, the story of 68 is told as a cumulative emergence of transgressive forces that reached a crisis in 1968, but then lost its momentum and sputtered into relative impotence, a decade later, after a paroxysm of feudal violence in the German autumn. Although the maximalist, at times defiantly utopian goals of the student movement are acknowledged to have been thwarted, much was changed, it's often argued, in the political cultures and social mores of the countries where it was most active. The new left may never have come to power, but certainly the old left was largely delegitimated with the rise of new social movements such as feminism, gay rights, and ecological activism, when these new social movements emerged in the wake of 68. Although abandoned well before it reached its ultimate goal, the long march through the institutions is often credited with leaving important reforms in its wake. And as Tiananmen Square, the Occupy movement, and the Arab Spring show, there were also later echoes of some of the same protest tactics, and we heard about protest earlier, developed by the student movement, albeit in the last two instances, with new features aided by the changed social media landscape of the 21st century. In the case of the spatial expansion, the German 68 has come to be understood as part of a worldwide phenomenon produced in part by common stimuli. For example, opposition to the Vietnam War and generational discontent with outdated university constraints, but also spread by a kind of mimetic contagion. Though national variations are, of course, acknowledged, the common forms of struggle adopted in different countries and the emphasis on youthful, often utopian activism are understood to transcend these national boundaries. As with the temporal expansion, here too a more or less unified, more or less coherent account results, which stresses the fruitful exchanges and mutual reinforcements that occurred across national boundaries. Perhaps the great figure who instantiates this is Daniel Cohn-Bendit. Perhaps only 1848, which saw unrest in many European countries without full success in any, has been seen as comparable in its transnational scope to 1968. Now, what the symbolic juxtaposition of Herbert Marcuse and Moshe Dayan suggests, however, is that another concept of an expanded field is possible now that a half-century has passed, one that is less coherent, one that is less harmonious than the ones that I've just described. Positing what we might call the stereoscopic or parallax quality of our hindsight, it resists the urge to come into focus as a singular three-dimensional vision. Now, although the familiar notion of a force field or constellation, introduced by Walter Benjamin and adopted by Adorno, is one inspiration for this alternative, another is a celebrated essay called Sculpture in the Expanded Field, written by the American art historian and critic Rosalind Krauss. It was published first in 1979, and many of you may know it through its inclusion in her collection, The Originality of the Avant-Garde and Other Modernist Myths. Drawing on the site-specific work of Robert Smithson and Robert Morris, Ros Krauss challenges the traditional notion of a piece of sculpture. She writes, "The logic of sculpture, it would seem, is inseparable from the logic of the monument. By virtue of this logic, a sculpture is a commemorative representation. It sits in a particular place and speaks in a symbolical tongue about the meaning of that place," end quote. Such traditional sculptures are normally figurative, normally vertical, normally separated from the surrounding site by the intervention of a pedestal, which functions in a way like a frame does around a painting to set the object apart. Now, in the late 19th century, Krauss goes on, the traditional notion of sculpture began to erode as the mediating function of the pedestal diminished, and the object lost its representational character, no longer an inert monument, but increasingly a self-referential abstraction. Rather than having positive content, it entered what she calls, quote, its negative condition. Its negative condition, a kind of sitelessness or homelessness, an absolute loss of place, end quote. If it could be defined at all, it was more in terms of what it was not, which in the case of sculpture was preeminently architecture and landscape than by what it was. Through a series of inversions and combinations, Krauss argues that sculpture should be understood now as one term in a dynamic constellation of its apparent opposites, which themselves can be inverted and combined in turn. Now, the details of Roz Krauss's argument, which draws on mathematical transformations into Klein groups and structural semiotics, well, these don't, I think, need to detain us now, but what is important to register is the implication of her expanding an apparently integral object, piece of sculpture, into what she calls, quote, a universe of terms that are felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation. Now, it seems to me what disrupts traditional notions of sculpture may also work for historical dates, these talismanic dates, that have been turned into inert monuments. In a way, 68 is one of those. No longer capable of serving simply as a nodal point of a single coherent narrative, or as a marker for parallel events across national borders, 1968 is best understood, I want to argue, in tense relationship to 1967. Juxtaposed rather than reconciled, they can only be brought together in a dynamic field of conflicting forces still in play even after a half century has passed. Reminiscent of Ernst Bloch's famous notion of Ungleichzeitigkeit, non-contemporaneity, but without his faith in the ultimate reconciliation of temporal contradictions, such an approach alerts us to the relativization of what seems to be a punctual moment, this moment called 1968, in a single historical space-time continuum. To understand the role of the Frankfurt School in the German 68 is also, I want to argue, to situate its history in the expanded field that includes the very different events of 1967, which resist incorporation into a single unified narrative. It is to register the importance of 67 in generating a negative relationship to aspects of the German 68, and in coloring the attitude towards post-colonial struggles and the discourse they have spawned. By expanding the field in this way, we will avoid, I want to argue, turning 1968 into an isolated monument on a kind of historical pedestal that masks its connection to the multiple historical contexts that can set it into motion and can help us understand its importance today. Now, I'm going to do this not only in terms of 67, but also briefly in terms of 1945 and 2019, but that's to get ahead of ourselves. Now, before attempting to articulate what we mean by this expanded field, we have to acknowledge that the magnetic pull and push of 67, understood broadly as turmoil in the Middle East, was not entirely lost on the protagonists of 68 in Germany at the time. That is, we have to remember that on June 2nd, 1967, less than a week before the outbreak of the Six-Day War, Benno Ohnesorg was killed by a policeman, many years later revealed as an East German Stasi agent, at a demonstration protesting the visit of the Shah of Iran. The radicalization of the student movement accelerated and intensified by the outrage at the murder was thus intimately entangled with unfolding events in the Middle East. An entanglement that only increased with the bitterly divided response of the movement to the Israeli victory in the Six-Day War. Prior to the war, the West German left, as might be expected in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the West German left was generally hesitant to criticize Israel and its role as a refuge for persecuted Jews. But Once the existential threat to Israel seemed over, and then the problematic occupation of Palestinian lands solidified, the taboo was lifted. The shift became explicit, sometimes historians argue, when a resolution proposed by Günter Grass at an SDS meeting to support the State of Israel's right to exist was defeated. We might know, parenthetically, this was very different from the Günter Grass from the one in 2012, who composed the provocative anti-Israel poem, Was gesagt werden muss, that stirred so much controversy. But in 1967, he was very much a sponsor of Israeli existence. Now, although the degree of East German involvement in the process is still much debated, the anti-Zionist stance of the Soviet bloc seems to have had an impact in reinforcing anti-imperialist sentiments in the German left, which often embraced the Palestinian cause with special gusto. What is not, alas, at issue is the troubling tendency of certain anti-imperialist, anti-American, anti-Zionist militants to draw on traditional anti-Semitic prejudices in their zeal to defend that cause. And perhaps the most blatant of these was Dieter Kunzelmann, who emerged from the German wing of the Situationists, the Spur, to become a leading figure in the Kommune 1 in Berlin, and an outspoken of what he called the philo-Semitic Judenknacks, or Juden neurosis, that induced post-war Germany to pay reparations to Israel. Because the Israeli cause was supported by the Americans and by the Springer Press in West Germany, it was easy for Kunzelmann and his comrades to see it as a pillar of the hated status quo. At the fringes of what became known as the extra-parliamentary opposition, the APO in Germany, were groups that matched rhetoric with action, including, in certain cases, lethal violence. Among the most notorious of these was the West Berlin Tupamaros, named after the Uruguayan guerrillas, to which Kunzelmann himself belonged. After some of their members went to the Al-Fatah training camp for terrorists in Jordan, they attempted to bomb the West Berlin Jewish Community Center on November 9, 1969, the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and desecrated monuments to victims of the Holocaust. Now, although the bomb, which was apparently given to them by a double agent, Peter Urbach, the bomb failed to explode, the episode signaled the beginning of a long and, I think, clearly destructive alliance, which culminated in the participation of two German radicals, Wilfried Bose, formerly a sociology student here in Frankfurt, and Brigitte Kuhlmann, their participation in the hijacking of the Air France flight that was forced to land in Entebbe, Uganda in July 1976. They were killed in the Israeli raid that rescued the hostages, with Kuhlmann in particular gaining added notoriety for the vicious way that she seems to have singled out Jewish passengers for special treatment, not very nice treatment. An even more explicit example of the radical German left's openness to the siren call of anti-Semitism was the lawyer and one-time Red Army faction member Horst Mahler, who passed through a Maoist phase to become a member of the far-right National Democratic Party of Germany in 2000 to his dissolution in 2003. An outspoken Holocaust denier, Mahler was ultimately convicted and served a lengthy prison sentence for Volksverhetzung. Now, much more, of course, can be said about the tangled relationship between the fringe elements of the German New Left, anti-Zionism, and, alas, anti-Semitism, a relationship that haunted German politics for years to come. Even Joschka Fischer, who of course made a successful career as a mainstream politician, had to explain his embarrassing presence at a PLO conference in Algeria in 1969. And another leading figure in the Green Party, Hans Christian Ströbele, who remained to the left of Fischer, had to resign his position when his resistance to the first Gulf War in 1991 turned into a defense of Iraqi missile attacks on Israeli citizens. And of course, there have been more recent philo-Semitic attempts by anti-nationalist leftists in the anti-Deutsche movement to defend Israel rather indiscriminately against any criticisms whatsoever. And I have no doubt that there are many in this audience who have a much clearer sense of the nuances of this story than I do, and can testify, perhaps, if they're of the age to do so, to their own experiences dealing with its implications. But what I now want to ask, what was the role of the Frankfurt School in this tangled web? Well, there were, it seems, echoes of Marcuse's idea about sexual liberation, along with those of Wilhelm Reich, indeed of Kunzelmann's thinking, and some readers of Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment may have used it to exculpate the specific German responsibility for the Holocaust in the name of a broader critique of Western civilization. But by and large, the direct impact of critical theory on the anti-authoritarian movement's problematic conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the general and direct impact was minimal. The most outspoken critic of Zionism in the first generation of members turns out to have been Erich Fromm, who had no use for nationalism of any kind. Instead, he remained true to the ideal of a binational secular state advocated by Judah Magnus and the Brit Shalom movement in Israel in the interwar era, or in Palestine at that time, in the interwar era. Now, Erich Fromm, of course, had long since severed his ties with his former colleagues in the Institute for Social Research, and his critique of Zionism played scarcely any role in the anti-authoritarian movement in Germany to operationalize critical theory. In fact, there are only one or two very quick and passing references in the 3 volumes that Wolfgang Kraushaar has edited on the Frankfurt School and the student movement, only a few references to Fromm in that work. The other members of the school all shared Marcuse's post-Holocaust anxiety over the threat to a safe haven for Jews in a world that had so recently spurned them. However much they may have criticized specific Israeli policies towards the Palestinians or bemoaned the blunting of the messianic potential of Judaism and the creation of a normal modern state, they had no qualms about defending its right to exist. As Jack Jacobs notes in his recent book, quite interesting book that some of you may already know, in the Frankfurt School, Jewish Lives and Anti-Semitism, as Jacobs writes, quote, Horkheimer's continuing doubts about the Jewish state had nothing in common with anti-Zionism. Horkheimer was well aware that purported anti-Zionism provided a thin screen both for neo-Nazis, such as those writing the late 1960s for the Deutsche Nationalzeitung, and for communists in Eastern Europe, end quote. Likewise, Adorno expressed support for Israel during the Six-Day War. Intermingling remarks on the death of Benno Ohnesorg in a lecture he gave on aesthetics, with references to, quote, the terrible threat to Israel, the refuge of countless Jews who have fled a horrifying fate, end quote. Adorno was in fact preparing a visit to Israel at the invitation of his friend Gershom Scholem before his sudden death in 1969. And even Leo Löwenthal, who had explicitly rejected Zionism as early as the mid-1920s, had no hesitation whatsoever in declaring Israel's right to exist after he made his first trip there in 1985. And the same attitude has continued into the second generation, as demonstrated by Habermas's frequent visits to Israel, beginning with a trip he took in 1977 to celebrate the 80th birthday of Gershom Scholem. Thus, despite the German New Left's tilt towards the Palestinians and against Zionism, which all too often opened the door to latent or even manifest expressions of anti-Semitism, there would seem little to justify expanding the field of 68 to include 1967 in any account that stresses critical theory's role in its inspiration. If, however, we step back a bit from the specific issues raised by the overlap or lack thereof between the German New Left's attitude towards Zionism and the Frankfurt School's fidelity to the idea of a safe haven for the world's Jews, there is, I think, much more to the symbolic meaning of the encounter between Marcuse and Dayan in wider terms that do, I would argue, justify expanding the field of 68 to include 67. For as Roz Krauss argues, expanded fields also include oppositions and negations as well as positive reinforcements. And I'm referring here to what we might call the Frankfurt School's relative indifference to events outside of the American and European context they'd experienced it firsthand. Or more precisely, their skepticism about the redemptive role often assigned anti-imperialist movements outside the West, such as the proletarian cause. And it's that ambivalent interpretation that I want to, bring into the discussion. They were indifferent. They didn't take anti-imperialism, post-colonial stuff seriously. Seems to be a deficit. On the other hand, they were perhaps skeptical, wisely so, about an overly redemptive notion of the alleged third world to save what was seen as the failures of the first. Now, when the Institute, to be sure, was founded back in the 1920s, the inclusion of the Marxist sinologist Carl August Wittfogel signaled at least some interest in that wider world. But in time, Wittfogel, who had been a staunch communist in the interwar years and became increasingly right-wing and anti-communist after the war, Wittfogel was increasingly marginalized. When his relationship with Horkheimer's Circle was officially severed in the late 1940s, there was no one to take his place as an expert in Asian affairs. As for Latin America, although Felix Weil moved back and forth from Buenos Aires to New York during the Institute's exile, and in fact wrote a book called Argentine Riddle in 1944, it was not considered a product of the Institute's work and had no echo in their thinking. Now, the relative indifference of the Frankfurt School to events outside of their own orbit, outside of Europe and the United States, basically, has often been lamented. It's often been seen as part of the problem. In a recent book titled Left-Wing Melancholia, the Italian intellectual historian Enzo Traverso, he now teaches at Cornell, sees it exemplified in what he calls the, quote, misdialogue or failed encounter between Adorno and the Afro-Caribbean cultural critic and novelist C.L.R. James. Perhaps best remembered for his pioneering study of the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins, James, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, Eric Williams, and Stuart Hall, was one of the leading figures in what has come to be called the tradition of Black Marxism. Although he and Adorno actually met for meals on several occasions when both were in exile in New York in the 1940s, neither seems to have taken much away from their time together. C.L.R. James, at that time a Trotskyist, aligned with Trotsky's former secretary, Raya Dunayevskaya, and the so-called Johnson-Forrest tendency of the Socialist Workers' Party, I think James was Johnson and Raya Dunayevskaya was Forrest, was introduced to Adorno by Marcuse. Now, it's interesting, Marcuse, who along with Erich Fromm maintained an extended correspondence with Dunayevskaya in the following decades, even though he ultimately broke with her. In any event, insofar as James and Dunayevskaya shared the analysis of the Soviet Union as an example of state capitalism, they wrote quite a bit about that, shared it with Friedrich Pollock, the chances for real dialogue with Adorno and with the Institute in general might have seemed auspicious. But, according to Traverso, and I have no reason to doubt him, Adorno and James differed in two fundamental ways. First, whereas Adorno had given up on the proletariat as the vanguard of revolution, and had no interest in the anti-colonial struggles then still largely on the horizon, James was enough of an optimist, a traditional Marxist-Leninist, to believe that revolution led by the working class was still historically possible, and that outside of Europe it was likely to begin. Rather than seeing the dialectic of enlightenment as a dark story of domination and decline, James still held out hope for struggle and resistance. Secondly, James did not entirely share Adorno's disdain for the culture industry as inherently conformist. Having himself been a skilled player of cricket in his native Trinidad, James later wrote a celebrated study of the differences between what he saw as the white version of the game played in places like the United Kingdom and Australia, and the very different one played in places like the Caribbean. In the years to come, James would be turned into a founding father in subaltern and post-colonial studies, while the Frankfurt School played only a minor role in the development. And so Traverso concludes, and I cite him, "We might legitimately ask whether such a misdialogue was not the symptom of a colonial unconscious of critical theory, at least in the early Frankfurt School," end quote. Now, it perhaps might be better to call it their non-colonial consciousness rather than colonial unconscious, but in any event, Traverso's general point is at least worth considering. The leaders of the Frankfurt School offered, for example, no serious response to earlier episodes in the decolonization process, such as, say, the Algerian War, which some historians have seen as critical and inspiring the nascent New Left, not only in France, but also here in Germany. It's not clear, however, how taking on board C.L.R. James's approach would have done much to compensate for the alleged Eurocentrism of critical theory and their pessimism about the chances for radical change. Although it might have focused more attention on the issues raised by the ongoing struggle against colonial rule and its racist legacy, insofar as James remained a Leninist, Trotskyists were, of course, Leninists, it's hard to say his belief in the vanguard Workers' Party would have helped them to overcome their often lamented political deficit, that notorious gap between theory and practice that Marxism insisted must be united. Moreover, to the extent that James shared in the romanticization of third world liberation struggles as viable alternatives to inadequate revolutionary activity in the first, his political wager on redemption coming from the periphery rather than the center of the world system of global capitalism does not look, at least from our current vantage point, does not look to have been realistic. However justifiable it certainly is to condemn the evils of European imperialism, however important it is to include the often disastrous interventions of the United States in that lament, it is not clear, I think, that liberation from colonial rule has produced models of political and economic emancipation that the rest of the world should hasten to follow. If we pause for a moment to consider the mixed legacy of the one prominent black Marxist who is directly influenced by critical theory, the celebrated African-American activist Angela Davis, I think that this rather skeptical conclusion will be reinforced. Angela Davis, as I'm sure many of you know, had studied philosophy with Marcuse at Brandeis in the early 1960s and came here to Frankfurt in 1966 to work with Adorno. Now, although she impressed him as an astute student of Kant, and in fact, you can go online and see a copy of the letter of recommendation he wrote for her, they were politically at odds. She later recalled that Adorno, and I'm quoting her, discouraged me from seeking to discover ways of linking my seemingly discrepant interests in philosophy and social activism, and, quote, suggested that my desire to work directly in the radical movements of that period was akin to a media studies scholar deciding to become a radio technician, end quote. Marcuse, of course, Marcuse vigorously did defend her decision to return to activism in the United States, where she quickly joined the Black Panthers and the Che Lumumba Club, an all-black group within the Communist Party. When she was fired from her position working at UCLA, she taught philosophy because of her membership in the party, and was then accused of supplying guns to Black Panthers who had murdered a prison guard and helping their comrades to escape Soledad prison. Marcuse never abandoned her. Captured after going underground when she'd been put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and tried for conspiracy to kidnap and murder, Davis, of course, was ultimately acquitted in 1972. But before that outcome, an international campaign was mounted on her behalf, and it was waged with special fervor here in Frankfurt, where supporters like Oscar Nate, with whom she'd studied during her year in Frankfurt, fashioned her into an example of the inherent unfairness of American justice. A solidarity committee held mass rallies beginning in 1970. Rallies had culminated in a monster congress in June 1972 with Marcuse as one of the main speakers. Although Oscar Nate's use of the occasion to denounce the terrorist activities of the Red Army faction may in fact have had the ultimately greater impact in the subsequent history of the German New Left, the outpouring of support for Davis demonstrated her potential role as a bridge between critical theory and the emerging post-colonial movement, as well as feminism and black power. Unfortunately, her unwavering loyalty to orthodox communism, which she had in fact imbibed fairly early in her life, her mother back in Birmingham had been a Communist Party member, her loyalty to communism did little to enable that outcome. Shortly after her triumphant visit to Frankfurt, Davis went to East Berlin, where she was greeted no less warmly by Erich Honecker, who had recently replaced Walter Ulbricht as the party leader. And she defended, as she had done before, the Soviet bloc invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Running on the American Communist Party ticket as vice presidential candidate alongside Gus Hall in 1980 and 1984, Angela Davis remained within the party until after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, in a way, her reputation has survived in many respects her dogged loyalty to the party. And she was able to emerge from her years in its thrall as an influential advocate for various progressive causes, most notably prison reform and third world feminism in later years. She's been teaching, she's now retired at UC Santa Cruz. But I would argue that lost by her extended allegiance to an old left that was then leaving the historical stage was any serious possibility that she might contribute to an overcoming of the Frankfurt School's Eurocentric perspective, which would then expand the field of 68 to include the implications of 67 understood from the perspective of an Enzo Traverso as a validation of third world struggles. And it's thus not surprising that for a long time, post-colonial theory took very little notice of the tradition of critical theory, finding much more intellectual nourishment in those disparate ideas that came to be called post-structuralism. In fact, even Heidegger could be used more effectively as an ally in the effort to provincialize Europe, as the subaltern and studies historian of India, Dipesh Chakrabarty, called it. Espen Hammer echoed the conventional wisdom in a book he wrote in 2006 on Adorno and the Political, when he wrote, and I quote, "With some important exceptions, Adorno seems to have been virtually oblivious to the concerns of post-colonialism, including race, discrimination, and imperialism. His blunt Eurocentrism, focused as it was on Germany and Austria in particular, predisposed him to reject, or at least view with suspicion, forms of cultural expression, notoriously jazz, that did not fit into his own framework. It also led him to stake most of his claims," Espen Hammer goes on, "for the role of art as embodying an alternative form of rationality on forms of aesthetic high modernism that since the mid-1960s have largely lost their attraction and relevance." So this is the, I would say, conventional view of the Frankfurt School as irrelevant to the post-colonial discourse that emerged mostly as a post-structuralistly inspired phenomenon. Now, despite these apparent blind spots in the early Frankfurt School, there have been a few isolated efforts, and we have to at least acknowledge these, to enlist insights from its legacy in the service of less parochial ends. As early as 1995, a Canadian scholar of Indian descent, Asha Varadharajan, compared the work of Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Adorno in a little book called Exotic Parodies. Noting Said's own powerful attraction to Adorno's ideas, and Edward Said was very interested in Adorno, she argued that negative dialectics provides a better theoretical support than deconstruction for subaltern studies. She writes, "Though Adorno was relatively silent on imperialism per se, his attention to the hegemony of the exchange principle and his critique of identitarian politics have, I believe, become indispensable to the affirmation of otherness, the resistance to global capitalism, and crucially to the discourse of modernity that arrogates to itself the regulative political concepts that encode the claims of nation within decolonized space." More recently, two American philosophers, Thomas McCarthy and Amy Allen, have drawn on different moments in the multi-generational tradition of critical theory to make somewhat similar arguments. McCarthy, an indefatigable translator and insightful interpreter of Habermas's work, wrote a wide-ranging study called Race, Empire, and the Idea of Human Development in 2009. In it, McCarthy condemns the ways in which traditional notions of modernization were tainted by racist and imperialist assumptions, but holds out hope for a more enlightened version of development theory that would combine the best legacies of Eurocentric liberal universalism with the value of multicultural particularism. Amy Allen, in contrast, is far less sanguine about the possibility of squaring that circle. In her work, The End of Progress, published in 2016, she criticizes McCarthy, along with Habermas, Axel Honneth, and Rainer Forst, for maintaining an unwarranted optimism about the ability of prior developmental theories to shed their problematic Eurocentric baggage. Determined to rid critical theory of its normative foundation in Enlightenment rationalism and its implicit belief in progressive cross-cultural developments, Allen seeks to combine Foucault's notion of genealogy with Adorno's stress and immanent critique. The goal, she says, is a more capacious notion of, and this is her term, metanormative contextualization, which she claims can include the insights of post-colonial discourse. The only way the ideal of progress can be salvaged, so Allen contends, is to uncouple it from the assumption that it was a past fact with universal implications, which tacitly privileges Western modernization, and then link it instead with the possibility, indeed the moral imperative, of future improvement measured according to culturally imminent norms. Now, ironically, despite the limited inclusion of non-European or non-American viewpoints bemoaned by commentators such as Traverso and Hammer, the first generation of critical theorists, Adorno in particular, have, as we see now, been praised by Varadharajan and Allen for their sensitivity to the dark side of the dialectic of enlightenment, in particular, its dubious model of universal progressive development. And although one commentator in a recent piece has argued that Habermas's post-secular interests in the enduring value of religious norms suggests that he too may be seeking a post-colonial reevaluation of critical theory, it has seemed much harder, I think, to make the second generation useful in this way. McCarthy, to the contrary notwithstanding, to mobilize the second and third generation's contributions for that purpose is more difficult. Well, whichever strand of the theory is picked as most likely to escape Eurocentric parochialism, there is, I want to argue, and I want to argue in a way somewhat perversely, a potential problem with any attempt to enrich the Frankfurt School legacy and compensate for its political deficit by infusing it with post-colonial discourse, however well-intended. To understand what I mean will require our returning to the importance of situating 68 in an expanded field that includes the events of 67. Now, we've seen that done already from one perspective. The Six-Day War, understood as a chapter in the Western imperialist incursion into the non-European world, an outcome of Orientalist ideology, and the resistance to it on the part of its victims. And certainly this was the interpretation that allowed the pro-Palestinian wing of the German New Left to denounce Zionism so fervently as continuous with the American war in Vietnam and other examples of Western imperialism. And because the Frankfurt School did not share this interpretation, the subsequent criticism we've encountered of its Eurocentric bias and its need to assimilate insights from post-colonial discourse would appear to be warranted. But even beyond the dangers and too quick and easy identification of the Israelis with a colonial settler experiment, and if one takes seriously their often violent struggle to expel the British from Palestine, I think that suggests it was more complicated than that. Even beyond that, it's difficult with the hindsight of the past half-century to assign the Palestinians, or for that matter, any other movement for colonial liberation, to assign them a redemptive role, a role that would somehow simply make up for the deficiencies of Eurocentrism. Now, I hasten to add, this is not to say that colonial independence was not a fully laudable goal, or that imperialism, whether direct through political control or indirect through economic or cultural domination, was in any way defensible. Whatever successes the decolonization process enjoyed in the past century, it's clear that many residues still remain of a world system heavily weighted in favor of the former colonial powers, and therefore the struggle to redress that balance is by no means over. But what from our perspective today is far less self-evident is that once liberated from Western domination, such countries or others in what used to be called the Third World, now often identified with the Global South, that those countries were able to realize the radical, even utopian potential imputed to them by the European supporters. Sympathizing, we might say, with the plight of the wretched of the earth was one thing, relying on them to redeem humankind was another. Mindless solidarity with something grandiosely called the global left made it hard to avoid supporting regimes and movements that were anything but emancipatory. And the most telling example of this failure, I think, is the woefully misplaced investment in Chinese Maoism during the Cultural Revolution by a number of prominent European intellectuals, mostly from France. One thinks, for example, of Sartre, Philippe Soler, Julia Kristeva, and Alain Badiou in particular. French Maoists were also fervent supporters of the Palestinian cause, or at least they were until 1972 and the brutal attack by the terrorist group Black September on Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. And it turns out that many of the leaders of the gauche proletariat, Alan Gazmar, André Glucksmann, Benny Levy, to mention a few, had been non-observant Jews and were shocked into losing their innocence about the purity of the anti-Zionist cause by the Munich Olympics massacre. So, in other words, this was one moment in which European hopes in a certain version of redemption from the East were dashed, but one could argue they remain still in a certain romanticization of the post-colonial project. Once again, not to say that imperialism has anything to justify it, just the exaggerated hopes invested in the countries that were liberated. Well, these, alas, have not come true. Well, to return to the main point of the talk, the idea of an expanded field helps us to avoid turning 68 into a discrete, self-contained episode in history, open to being represented in heroic terms, open to being put on a pedestal and available for simple commemoration. In putting it into play with the 6 Days War and its effects, it alerts us to the importance of competing historical narratives, which can decenter 1968 beyond the more conventional temporal and spatial expansions mentioned earlier. Now, we've seen it possible to interpret it in several ways. The narrative can be seen as potentially compatible, the narrative of 67 with the dominant image of 68, both as somehow moments in the history of human emancipation. The latter can be seen, 68, as unleashing forces for change that might have been enriched by their integration with the comparable forces in the former, 1967, that go by the name of anti-imperialist decolonization. And here, those anti-Zionist voices in the German New Left, despite their deplorable mobilization on occasion of anti-Semitic prejudices, well, they can be seen as part of a constellation that, despite its never really coming to fruition, held out possibilities for a more fundamental challenge to the status quo. And I think in a larger sense, the exhortation of commentators such as Enzo Traverso and Amy Allen to correct the Eurocentric bias of critical theory with lessons learned from post-colonial discourse amplifies this interpretation, which sees third world redemptive politics as a way to overcome the pessimism and political deficit of the Frankfurt School. So this is one way to sort of think about the expanded field. But this interpretation is, I think, called into question if we read 67 in the way the majority of the members of the Frankfurt School did at the time. That is to say, essentially, as a threat to the survival of the Jewish people that was only narrowly averted. If we look at it from this perspective, a very different constellation emerges in an enlarged field, and one in which the lingering residues of 1945 play a vital role. And I mean 1945 as, let's say, the unresolved legacy of the Second World War, of the Third Reich. Now, Germany, it's often been remarked, was more than any other locus of New Left politics haunted by its still unmastered past. The outrage of the student movement was fueled by a sense that the sins of their fathers had not really been worked through, both in terms of the continuity of personnel in positions of power and the full confrontation of the reasons for the rise of Nazism. And of course, conversely, the establishment's deep anxiety over what they saw as the excesses of the extra-parliamentary opposition expressed fears that the rule of law was being trampled by radicals willing to use violence to undermine the hard-earned achievements of the post-war West German political order, thus, so they feared, repeating the mistakes of their Weimar predecessors. In other words, the still unfinished business left to settle in 1945 played a special role in the German version of 1968, much more so than the United States, Mexico, France, or any other part of the world. But there was another potential reading of the unfinished business of 45, one that was in a way more sinister. As we've noted, despite its qualms about specific Israeli policies, most of the members of the Frankfurt School were deeply anxious about the renewal of the annihilation of the Jewish people interrupted by the defeat of Nazism. Had Israel lost the Six-Day War, that was their fear. And as a result, they resisted the simplistic reading of the conflict as a black and white episode in the anti-imperialist struggle for global justice, a reading which seduced many on the left, and which in a way we can see echoed in Traverso and Allen. For them, for the Frankfurt School, the destruction of the Jewish people was enough of a real threat to outweigh their criticisms of specific Israeli policies undermining legitimate rights of the Palestinians. Acknowledging this fear helps us to understand and perhaps even sympathize with their Eurocentric inability to invest much hope in the putatively redemptive mission of the Third World, and their hesitation before expressing unqualified solidarity with the so-called global left. It allows us to see the failure of Adorno's lunches with C.L.R. James to create an alliance of critical theory and post-colonial discourse, to see that failure as perhaps not so lamentable after all. Now, from the perspective of a half-century later, the issues raised by the Six-Day War and its aftermath are, of course, anything but resolved, and both sides in the conflict seem hopelessly locked in a struggle without end. But one thing I think is clear. It is now impossible to summon the confidence that once invested post-colonial discourse with its halo of political righteousness. The lingering hope that the stalled European revolution would somehow be jump-started by those hitherto oppressed peoples who are finally asserting their place on the historical stage seems, at least at this juncture, unrealized. There may have been Maoist enthusiasts of the Cultural Revolution who looked to China of those years for answers, but the country that is now fast becoming the most powerful engine of global capitalism is anything but a beacon of emancipation. And similar appraisals, alas, have to be made of the once shining future of the Latin American left, now in such shambles, as well as the hopes placed in national liberation struggles in Indochina or Africa, not to mention the Arab Spring of only a few years ago. In other words, to return to that encounter in Jerusalem with which we began, it now seems clear, at least from our perspective, that the historical shadow cast by Herbert Marcuse as the embodiment of the idealistic student movement has been much shorter, much less pervasive than that cast by Moshe Dayan, who we might call the master of nationalist realpolitik and the art of war. Or to stay with our master metaphor, the gravitational pull of 68 in its expanded field has not had the power of other talismanic years in the historical calendar. And these would include 1967 and 45, whose unfinished business we've seen especially potent in Germany, but also 2019. For any historical field must take into account the present as a moment that helps to define how we understand what came before, how we understand it as a possible future that was actually realized, or as one that was ironically reversed. And it now seems, at least at this moment, that the line of force that can be drawn from 1967 to 2019 crackles with far more energy than that between 1968 and the present. But, and I want to end with this, but before concluding on too sour a note, it would also be prudent to remember that our own present moment will itself fade into the past as the untotalized field of history continues relentlessly to expand and new narratives, both complementary and contradictory, vie for supremacy. For all we know, the Frankfurt School's controversial strategy of hibernation, as Habermas once called it, may still prove prescient as its messages and bottles wash up on new shores and the relative gravitational pull of 67 over 68, well, it might be reversed by events yet unforeseen. Well, it may be best to leave it to another conference held 50 years hence on the centenary of 68 to assess such conjectures. What can't be doubted, however, is that the ever-evolving tradition of critical theory will certainly have much to chew on in the interim. Thanks very much.